This week on Hell of a Picture, we enter the 80s with a somewhat irregular Best Picture period piece, Amadeus. We start the episode with a long talk on the nature of genius and where it comes from. We both share stories about the 1985 Oscars, and we discuss the absolution of the ending. Dave tells us why he'd rather be Salieri over Mozart, and I rage on over the Kansas City Chiefs. Rock us, Amadeus! That's this week on Hell of a Picture. Welcome to Hell of a Picture, a weekly movie podcast where we discuss an unforgettable film, and if it truly is a hell of a picture. My name is Andrew Bartlett, and I'm sitting across the internet, as I do each and every week, from the Wolfgang Mozart to my Antonio Salieri, Mr. David Hollingsworth.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you for giving me Mozart. That's very
sweet.
You
get Mozart's.
Yeah, I get the tragic die early guy, and you get the bitter but wealthy and long-lived guy. So, you know what? Given the choice, tough call.
Well, we'll decide. Actually, maybe we'll talk about that later about which you would prefer, to be the genius or the mediocre, artist.
Yeah.
Who knows? But that's because we're getting into Amadeus this week. We're continuing our Oscar run. Man, we have gone through some bangers, and we're keeping it going with the 1984 Best Picture winner, Amadeus, a loosely biopic, I would say a loose biopic on the life of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. So this is a fun one. This was one that I probably saw, I don't know, man, 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Could barely remember anything from it, but excited to revisit it this week and get into it with you. You had never seen this before, or no?
I had, but like you, it had been a long time, and I remembered. I remembered the one scene where he sort of feigns flatulence at the piano for some reason. Like, that was the thing I remembered most vividly. But otherwise, it had largely escaped me. And you are right to say loosely based. It's based on a play, actually, which was written sort of and inspired by kind of like a Viennese urban legend that sort of creates this dynamic between Mozart and Salieri, which is largely untrue, historians will say. Like, they were friends and colleagues, and all this stuff is kind of made up, but it makes for a very interesting story and an interesting exploration into character and genius and art.
Yes.
And so, yeah. One interesting thing of note, I was only able to find the director's cut of this film. Were you able to find the theatrical release?
No, I couldn't. And upon some research, because I think the theatrical release is about 2.5 hours, and the director's cut is 3 hours. Like, I think it adds about 20 minutes.
It does, yeah.
Runtime. Yeah, and a lot of the stuff that's added is sort of there's backstories between Mozart, like the scene where she approaches Salieri, and kind of like throws herself at him to get Mozart as get him the gig or whatever. That was sort of added in. There were some other scenes which sort of relates to why she hates him so much later in the film. But I couldn't find the theatrical run. And I think all the like Blu-rays or DVDs or streamings have all been the director's cut.
Yeah, that's interesting. I couldn't even, I figured you could buy, the theatrical release, somewhere, but I couldn't find a digital copy of it from any source. So, yeah, it's kind of odd, but that's good that we both watched the same cut anyway. So we can at least address the same film.
There was an interesting line I think I read somewhere online where Roger Ebert was saying that the original theatrical cut was cut down so that it was for home video, so it could fit on one home video tape.
Yeah,
because if it got past 3 hours or 2, 4, whatever, however length it was, that you'd have to do a second tape. So they wanted to keep it. So that's why they originally cut it down.
Yeah, and it's From what I understand too, yeah, you're right. It was, I think the nudities, like the scene where she bears herself, is part of the director's
Yeah.
cut. So
Yes.
Milos really wanted that in there for some reason. I guess for obvious reasons. Um, but also some of the performance scenes were elongated, so you do get a little more
Right.
exposure to the music, which is cool, which is totally cool, and I do support. But yeah, we will discuss the runtime in our assessment of the film. And unless you have any objections, I say we just get to it.
Yeah, let's get to the rundown, man, and let's get people caught up on Amadeus.
Yes, certainly will. So, years of torment have taken their toll on Antonio Salieri. Despite the obvious trappings of success, he is a broken man who one evening attempts suicide in needlessly gruesome fashion, since this was an era of over the counter opium. But Salieri fails to take his own life, and we find him in convalescence at a sanatorium, where a priest has come to hear his confession. Now, what he confides to the priest is a story of genius and jealousy, of divine gifts and diabolical curses. It is the story of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, his life, his death, and Salieri's complicity in the latter. Amadeus was released in 1984, very good year, directed by Another Game for Milos Forman, and based on a play of the same name by Peter Schaefer, who would also co-write the screenplay. It stars F. Murray Abraham as Antonio Salieri, Tom Hulce as Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Elizabeth Berridge as Constanze Mozart, a name I can't help but want to pronounce Costanza. I kept thinking throughout the movie that someone was going to call her Can't Stand Ya, which might not have been totally out of place given the odd tone of this film, something we both noted, and I think we will both talk
Yeah.
about at some point.
Yeah.
So at the 85 Oscars, Amadeus would be nominated for 11 awards, winning 8, including lead actor for Abraham, an award that Hulce was also nominated for, it should be noted. Director for Foreman, adapted screenplay for Schaefer, and basically everything to do with the aesthetics of film, costume, makeup, so on. For Best Picture, it would be pit against The Killing Fields, A Passage to India, Places in the Heart, and A Soldier Story. Now, in an Oscar ceremony that would feature actual elephants on stage as part of a nearly 7-minute presentation for Best Costume Design, which is nuts when you think about how tight they are on time at the Oscars now, the thing that is most remembered is Sally Field's comparatively brief and slightly misquoted "You like me" speech. Now, the popular memory of the line is that she says, "You like me, you really like me." And though our shared misrecollection of the speech captures her almost off-putting mania, and if you watch the clip, it is off-putting. John Malkovich thinks so, that's for sure. It doesn't quite get the line right. The line is simply, "You like me, you like me." It makes for an interesting display of a performer's need for validation, something I think she shares with characters of Amadeus, particularly Mozart himself, who frequently asks people in this movie, "Did you like it?" And that is your rundown.
I will add a little postscript to your rundown. In researching the Oscars of that year, Sir Laurence Olivier, Sir Lawrence, he this was a pretty memorable moment as well from that Oscars. He was brought out to present the Best Picture, and he kind of saunters out on stage, and this is obviously later in his life, and he sort of comes out and he says, "Oh, thank you. This is a great honor to be presenting this, and hopefully I won't mess it up too bad." And then he doesn't read any of the nominees, and he just takes the thing, and he's just like, "And the winner of the Best Picture," and you can hear people in the crowd be like, "What's happening? No, like this, like kind of people like." He says, "And the Best Picture is Amadeus." And then, thankfully, the producer, Saul Zenitz, I think is how you pronounce his name.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what that is. Zaintz, maybe?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Zaitz, yeah. He came up, and while accepting the award, he took time out and mentioned all the Best Picture nominees. So,
very classy. Very classy.
Class act by Saul, but classic Olivier right there.
I mean, that's a pretty memorable ceremony. Then you have this incredible gaffe at the Best Picture reveal, and Sally Field, and oh man, that's pretty wild.
Yeah, during the Best Picture speech, Saul says he starts it off and he's sort of like, the producer said they wanted me to do 35 minutes, so that we'll clock in at exactly 4 hours, but my speech is only going to be 22 minutes long. So it's like they were creeping up to 4 hours. They were 3.5 hours. It's like,
bonkers.
Guys, come on, get with it. But yeah, let's get into this discussion here. You mentioned it in your rundown, and talking about genius, and we sort of were playing with that idea, or discussing it sort of right off the hop. And this kind of exploration of genius, I would say this film does it almost better than any other film I've seen when discussing the idea of genius. It's like we've seen a lot of movies before where it's like we see these like, great artists and great people throughout history and like how they get, inspiration or how they create their work, but we don't really get the idea of like genius and where this comes from. And this movie, it's all about that.
Yeah, and it takes, the attitude of the characters, I guess, maybe not the attitude of the film, but the attitude of the characters, certainly Salieri, is that genius is bestowed rather than earned, in terms
Right.
of where it comes from. He frames it as divine and part of an intelligent design. So, for him, for that character, there's kind of two inescapable conclusions of life. One is that God has made him a great musician, him being Salieri. He is great, undeniably. But two, God has slighted him by making Mozart, a far less virtuous man, an even greater musician. And this is really the motivating idea of Salieri, who is our main character. It's his rift with God, because he was denied the gift of true genius as he sees it. And one thing he fails to realize, though, but that I think the movie tells us, is that he's also kind of spared the curse of genius.
The curse of genius. That's
Mm-hmm.
interesting perspective. But I love that format of the film. And you mentioned Salieri being the main character. And like too often with biopics, it's kind of the perspective of who we're following, right? Elvis, right. Ray, the list goes on and on. But here we're told the story of Amadeus, Mozart, through Salieri.
Yes.
And really his jealousy, and that's the driving force of the film. That's such a brilliant device. And through his point of view, we get the idea of what genius can be and what it is and where Mozart gets it from. I was really surprised by the idea that, Salieri believed that it could only be God that gives artists their vision and their gift. Like that's why, we're told that right from the start, how he talks about how he just prays for like hours on end and just prays that God will like touch him with like divine intervention, I guess, and give him genius to create beautiful music. But with that, I found it interesting that, he's when he's telling kind of the priest this story of his life, he has the inability to really see himself as evil when he's like a pretty evil character when you think about it, right?
Mm.
I wouldn't say he's one of the most evil characters in the history of cinema, but like in the context of the story, he's a jealous person that, plots to murder Amadeus. And he's convinced that God, but the character is convinced that God is the one who's in control. And he's just ignorant to the fact that, seeing his own flaws and seeing himself as evil.
Yeah, this is sort of the problem sometimes with the idea of grand design, intelligence. Like,
Yeah.
it kind of absolves people a little bit. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like this is like,
Right.
it's like, oh, God destined this, God determined this, yada yada. Like, it takes away some of the agency of people to both do good and bad. And so, yeah, he sees what he's doing as a justifiable response to the slight God has made against him. So it's very
That's
narcissistic. Right. And yeah, like I said, he failed to sort of realize the curse of genius. He sees it as just like purely a gift, and even though it's self-serving, he frames it as a way to honor God. He wants to have the power so that he can honor God, is how he says it. But really, I think he
Right.
wants it for himself, you know. But there's that scene at the beginning of the movie when the priest enters the sanatorium to come hear his confession, and that scene kind of, it captures right away the weird blend of this movie, because
Mm,
it's partly silly and partly serious, like the way that, like,
yes.
sort of the people who are committed here, are viewed. And like, I get, and what, like, the thing that sort of hit me about it, apart from that, was just that right away the film is kind of telling you that genius and madness are not that far removed from each other, or at least that's what I took from it.
Right.
The difference really just seems to be the ability to process and express the voices in your head as opposed to being tormented by them. Because it's said a
Right.
few times here that Mozart, God speaks to him. There's a voice in his head. The voice of God is in his head. And that's probably what a lot of people in an asylum would say to you too, certainly
Right.
here. And yeah, there's also this, there's this external threat to genius that we see as well from Salieri, from the other courtiers and things like that. They're envious and they don't really understand him, with the exception of Salieri. Like, Salieri recognizes how good it is, but other people don't, and so both of these things will kind of conspire to suppress Mozart in his career.
Yeah, I love how you mentioned God talking to Mozart, and it's only Salieri who believes this. I think, but like, I guess Mozart's wife and like recognizes it to a degree, like she and his father does, but I think his father, maybe he noticed it from a very young age. He certainly seemed to when he was like, pushing him to for these performances as just kind of this child. And I don't think either one of them or anybody else really debates his genius. But Salieri is the one, and this is maybe because we're following his story, but he's the one who's obsessed with where it has come from, and it's God that has given this to you, and God, and it's like when he's telling the story to the father, he's talking about his hatred for God, not Mozart. He's like he hates Mozart, but he's not. It's like it's he wants to get back at God for doing this, right? And it's it has to come from some higher being for him. And I do think that this is such a great vessel for for that exploration throughout the film. And so often we're presented a film, like I said, like in a biopic where there's this genius at work, and very rarely are we presented the idea of exploring where genius comes from. It's just sort of like a lot of times we're watching these things. It's just like, oh, they just have this gift, but
Mm.
you know, with Mozart, or with this film, I should say, with Amadeus, um, it just seems like that's the driving force and the driving theme in the film. Um, but yeah, Mozart, I think, is this dueling character because he doesn't believe that. I don't know if he believes that God's touched him. He just he's just kind of like, oh yeah, I just like came up with it, or it's just like, oh, I just like this is what I think is right and whatever. But then there's also this other side of him that's tormented by this pursuit for perfection. Like, so I'm curious as to see like his perspective. Like, does that character believe that he's touched by God? I don't think so. I think he just sort of knows what's right and what's wrong in a sense of music.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think Salieri's like sort of feelings would be unique, especially in the time. I mean, this is a time
Right,
where
right, right, right.
religion is pretty dominant in the world, particularly in music. Like, you got, like, at this time, like, you sort of see it, like Mozart's first job, was in the service of like, I think he's like a cardinal or a bishop or something like that of Salzburg or something like that. Most
Yes.
music, of the era was commissioned by the church, in a lot of cases. And typically those were the jobs that you have. Like, Mozart was one of the first people, just to sort of break briefly and talk about the actual history of it. Mozart was one of the first people to kind of go independent in his composition career. Like, just a generation before him, probably, the most well-known composer, today of the Baroque period, Johann Sebastian Bach, he was basically an employee for his whole life. He worked for people, and like that, like
Right.
the idea of going independent and sort of doing what Mozart did was kind of unthinkable. And so, in an entrepreneurial sense, he was very different. Um, but yeah, this just sort of to say that the influence of religion was super strong here, and I don't think
Hmm.
Salieri would be unique in his feelings. Now, whether or not Mozart thought that, he was certainly narcissistic, or the presentation of him here is certainly
Sure. Yeah.
narcissistic. So he might, I don't think he ever comes right out and says it in the movie because he's not a terribly religious person, it seems. Um, but he certainly doesn't lack for irrational belief in himself. Like he knows he's great. You know what I
But
mean? Like,
yeah, but for somebody that throughout the film is, like you said, is kind of obsessed with or knowing that how great he is, and that's sort of presented. He's also somebody that's like very insecure.
he is very insecure. Yeah, he's always
Yeah.
asking me or asking people, like, especially Salieri, did you like it? Like
Hmm.
he's really, it's weird. Like he's very concerned with Salieri's acceptance, and yet he's also
Hmm.
really derisive of him. Like he will insult him. Like he sort of, there's that scene where he's impersonating him at the piano, and he makes himself out to seem like kind of a dunce as he's doing it. But yet he really wants him to like his stuff. It's a weird dichotomy.
Yeah, the it's it's the duality, I think, of the characters in the whole film, right? And this is what I was mentioning before. Like, I would argue that almost all the characters in the film, um, you know, all of them have sort of these conflicting ideas, duality when it comes to like their beliefs about themselves and their beliefs about other characters, right? Like we see that with Mozart, like you said, you like me, but he also knows that he's too good to be a teacher and have students. He needs to focus on his music, on composing. Salieri hates Mozart because he's given this divine gift, but then also like recognizes that divine gift and can recognize how like he's the most brilliant composer he's ever experienced.
Mm.
That's and then even the his wife and the father. There's all these characters. I would say probably the only three would be like those three stooges that the kind of work for the, I guess, the king, or the
The emperor, yeah, the
the
Habsburg
emperor.
emperor,
Like,
yeah.
yes, right. Sorry. So those three stooges that are just sort of the Italian guy and the and the
Yeah.
director, and those you know they're sort of out to get Mozart the whole time. But like I said, that's what makes interesting film, and that's what makes interesting characters, right? It's like you can't just say Salieri is just this pure evil driving force that wants to kill Mozart. It's like he has to recognize Mozart's genius for that to work.
Well, he never misses a performance, right? I mean, even after, Mozart
Mm-hmm.
has sort of lost favor in Vienna, and yeah, Salieri still makes a point of attending everything he does, even when he's producing these populist kind of mainstream operas, that are really popular with the common folk, but not so popular at court. Salieri is still there watching, and he says to him, like when Mozart is dying, he's like, I would never miss one of your performances, like,
Yeah.
and he's sincere in that. Like he obviously really really loves his work, but it's just this, he just cannot get over this indignancy he has at being lesser than. And yeah, it's really, it's tragic. You feel bad for him. You probably shouldn't, but you kind of do, because it is
Yeah.
hard. It must be hard because he is extraordinary. Like Salieri, by most people's standards, would be a genius. He was court composer in Vienna, of all places. Like, I mean, that is not
Yeah.
an easy thing to achieve, and his music is really quite brilliant. But just when you stand next to something that seems divine in its in its capability, it must be really really rattling for someone like him to have to contend with.
So switching gears, this one Best Picture, and I'm curious as to your thoughts on what if this felt like a Best Picture to you, and upon rewatch, and just your thoughts on that. because this sort of, for me, when I watch this kind of ticks a lot of the boxes, and I'm wondering if it does for you as well.
It does. You're right for sure, but I mean, certainly like the period piece. The Oscars love a period piece, but this might
Yes.
be the weirdest period piece I've seen in some ways. Like, because like the sanatorium scene, it's both silly and serious, and it doesn't really seem to commit one way or the other throughout the film. You know what I mean? Like it it's very strange. It walks this kind of line and does it really well, because it could be kind of it might just sort of become eccentric and like and unfocused, and then kind of distract you from the quality of the film. But somehow it does both of these things, the silly and the serious, and still maintains its quality. I'm kind of surprised this won Best Picture. I like it as a Best Picture. I think it's well deserved. But it surprises me that it won. Did you feel the same way? Like, does it seem weird that the Academy chose this?
Um, I mean, I'm not surprised that it won Best Picture. Won eight Academy Awards. But for my point of view, I think it filled two of the Academies during this time, especially most important characteristics of a Best Picture, period, biopic, and a musical. Now, this isn't a classic musical in the sense of like My Fair Lady, Sound of Music, but it's an exploration of music and classical music too. I mean, it's prevalent obviously throughout the whole film. We get these long performances, and it's paramount to the whole film structure. But I was really, I like how you talk about it's being both silly and serious, because it's like I'm watching it, and it's like I'm trying to figure out, if it's a comedy or a drama. You know what I mean? And it's like from the moment we're introduced to sort of Mozart, I guess as an adult, and he comes in and he just has that laugh. It's like you're like, what is
very
happening?
Jarring. Yeah, it's very jarring.
And like throughout the whole movie, he's just, that laugh just keeps happening. You're just like, wait, what is this, right? This weird, flamboyant, like over the top character. You're just sort of like, then you think is this a caricature? But then, like you said, there's these really serious moments, and it's sort of a serious subject matter. But I was just sort of blown away by this idea that this, when you're kind of brought into this time period, I guess, this like moment in time of like where music doesn't exist as it does today, obviously, but it's like there feels like there's this I don't know what the word is. I don't want to say authenticity or like realism to it, but like the characters just like, they're not just prim and proper. There's this like human element to them where he's like, like you said, he's cares what people think about it, but he's also like drunk and like boozing flat out and being like pissing his money away, and then going out and partying with all these like random people, and then he's just such a tormented character, but that comes across, and you sort of like, even in listening to Salieri, talk about his hatred for him and why God chose him, and what a buffoon he is, and what this like animal. It's like you just want to be like, but like who cares? It's like it doesn't matter. It's like you're actually witnessing greatness. It's like when we watch sports right now, and I was listening to a podcast recently, and they were talking about this is a bit off topic, but they're talking about Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs, and they're going for a three-peat in the Super Bowl. And it's like you're watching, it's like, and people are upset about it because everybody wants the Bills. I'm a Bills fan. I wanted the Bills to get in. And it's like, oh man, I want the Bills to get in. It's like, I'm sick of this. I'm sick of seeing Kansas City. But we're also like, on the flip side of that, it's like we're witnessing greatness. Is that okay? Can you just can you sit back and appreciate what you're watching when you're in the moment? Is it only like when you look back and be like, oh, like Michael Jordan in the 90s, like he was the greatest ever, and he's like nobody can touch him, or watching the Tom Brady or any other sports, or watching like, you know, any musician throughout history that you can be like, in the moment, can you recognize that this is genius in the moment? I don't know what I'm sort of getting on with that. I'm just sort of trying to get to the point where it's like, is it okay to recognize genius in the moment versus like, I don't know, being not being good enough, or being, I don't know, being mediocre in the moment. Do you know what I mean? Like, so Salieri is mediocre and he's not okay with that. And it's like, but you can still be something great and still be in the presence of greatness. I don't know what I was getting on with that.
Yeah, I mean, I mean,
it's a rambling way to say that I'm sick of the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, to hell with the Chiefs. No, I mean, look, it is often the case that things are not appreciated in their time, or
Right.
you know, can face, I guess, a certain fatigue in their time. Like, you know, like with a dynasty in sports, people do become sort of tired of seeing it all the time, and then years later they'll think back on it quite fondly, you know, and
Right.
reminisce, you know, on its greatness. And you know, I mean, a lot of people were not celebrated in their time to, you know, to the level that they deserved, and oftentimes that is because they exceed the sensibilities of the time, and so people cannot appreciate what they're seeing because they don't understand it, and it takes
Right.
some time there afterwards for people to sort of the, I guess, the mean of talent to come to the level to be able to commonly understand what this person did a generation before it, you know, the world was ready for it. So you do see that this inability to appreciate things in their time. Mozart was appreciated in his time, though, for sure, by most. You
Right.
know, it
I guess what
there was never any doubt on his genius.
Right. It's like, I guess I'm questioning the, like, well, like, I'll just pose this question for you then. Would you rather be Salieri in this situation, or would you rather be Mozart? You know?
I would rather be Salieri, 100%, because he lives comfortably. He is respected. You know, you do see that his music is, even while he's still alive, or at least the way it's portrayed here in the film, his music is forgotten. Like he says, he plays for the priest, you know, a couple of his tunes, and the priest doesn't recognize them. He hums him one little snippet of Mozart, and and the guy recognizes it right away.
Yeah.
And you know, so Salieri is he is being forgotten in his own time. And that is the difference here. So, like, I mean, you know, Mozart is immortal, but he dies young. So there's a great irony there.
Yes.
Salieri lives a full life and does so comfortably with all the perks of wealth, a fine position at court and all this stuff, but he is not celebrated through the ages. So this is the trade-off. For me, I will take living comfortably while I'm alive rather than having, you know, monuments dedicated to me after I'm dead, because what the fuck do I care? I'm already dead. What about you?
I don't know, man. Yeah, I don't know. I like to think that I would want to be like a genius. I would want to be like a Mozart. I would want to have this divine gift, but like, I don't think I care enough. You know what I mean? Just about sort of that sort of those things in general, right? Art and creation, and you know, I think there's something to say about a life of mediocrity, right? And that's what we're all.
It's probably
all
a happier one.
Yeah, if you're not obsessing over not being a genius, then yeah. Like,
yeah.
You know, like, look at all the characters in the films. Like, look at the people that go, look when the vaudeville performance, and they're performing to all like the sort of the slums, or like the poor people, and they're all just like having an amazing time, and they're just like enjoying the music, and it's like, this is the best. And it's not, whereas we witness Salieri, where he's sort of like, all he wants to do is have the divine gift that Mozart has.
Yeah, well, again, like Salieri refers to himself as being mediocre, but he's really not. You know what I mean? Like he's so
Mm,
close to genius. He is close enough to understand it, yet while not being
right.
able to replicate it. And that's really the source of his madness. I think that he with one of the few who can really appreciate it because he's that smart, but he's not smart enough to do it himself. And so that is the torment right there. But I think for most of us, you know, being average or even being well above average is probably the better way to live, because you see that like Mozart's is driven mad by in some ways by his genius, and you see that Salieri is as well, by even that second tier of genius. So this sort of goes back to that, like the great man theory of history that we talked about with Lawrence of Arabia, we talked about with Oppenheimer. And
Yeah.
it's like, is history propelled forward by great individuals, or is it sort of trends and forces? And maybe it's a little bit of both. There is this generational rare impossible genius that does come about, like Mozart, like Beethoven there afterwards, Brahms, Mendelssohn, you could go on. But there's still also a lot to be said for what is achieved by the collective works of a lot of other people just who work hard. God doesn't talk to them, but they try really hard and they practice and they hone their
That's right.
craft. They do what we all have to do to be good at stuff when it's not just given to us, as we see it here. So, yeah, no, it's give me Salieri or some even lesser level than Salieri. I'm totally fine with that.
I think the Salieri, you've mentioned it a few times now, but his ability to recognize the genius, I think, is his torture. Is really his torture, right? It's like he's right there. He's close to it. He can recognize it, but he can't create it. Even in when looking at the page, and he can read the notes and know, oh my God, this is beautiful. This is ingenious. He's watching the opera that Mozart puts off. One of the first ones, I think, and it's the 4 hour one, and
Yeah.
he's like captivated, and he's like in awe, and he's just like looks down, and he sees the emperor like yawn. You know what I mean? And
Hmm.
he's like that. Yes, yes, that was amazing for him because, but it's again, it's that torture of his torture is knowing the genius that is Mozart.
Yeah, too many notes, I believe, Your Majesty. Was That's one of the great lines in the movie. What was the problem with too many notes? I think, yeah,
Yeah,
and yeah, I really like that. No, I mean, I love the ending of this film. To jump ahead chronologically in the film, because we're talking about mediocrity, we're talking about genius, and
yeah,
I like when a movie kind of offers us solace for something that we're all a little guilty of, and
yeah.
at the end, Salieri's being wheeled in that way, and he's talking to the inmates. He's really talking to us. He says, "I
Mm-hmm.
absolve you for your media." He's forgiving us all for our inadequacies, and
Right.
like the great sin of Salieri, I think that a lot of people can relate to is this sense that we deserve better, that life, or for him, God, is not fair. He obviously handles this quite poorly, but I think the movie does offer us kind of that forgiveness for being what we are, which is mediocre and maybe a little jealous and maybe a little petty. And
Yeah.
it's okay to not be a genius. Genius is rare, nearly impossible. It's fine to not be Mozart. It's really fine to not be Salieri. Um, you
That's
know,
right.
most people, don't even come close to either. Um, you might interpret it like we said, that the film is saying, or that history is telling us it's better to be Salieri than Mozart. But you know, it also it's also very important to the film and to history, the immortality of genius, and that is for sure.
Yeah, it's I also love how the sort of it the idea of genius in the film, like you said, is really in the eye of the beholder, right? And it's like we're following Salieri throughout this journey, so we're seeing he's the one telling us that he's a genius, right? But like I as I was saying, the 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 poor people that go to the vaudevillian show, like they sort of say it throughout that, like, oh, this his opera only played 5 times, or only had a run of 9 shows, and it's like he goes to the house with all the dogs, and the guy's like,
Yeah.
yes, and now go, and it's like, and he's like, well, next time I play for your dogs, one of your, let me know or whatever, and he's just too good for that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, for that guy, he doesn't give a shit that Mozart is a genius. You know what I mean? It's all in the eye of the beholder, sort of thing. So, yeah,
I mean, I think he does care. I think it's just very like he wants to be able to say, I had this guy, this genius, come to my house and play in my salon for my dogs. You know what I mean? Like, for him, it's
sure,
an affectation
I guess,
of wealth, and affluence, and so he fancies proximity to genius, as a lot of people do, without fully appreciating it. You know what I mean? So it's just to touch briefly, like what you talk about with the vaudevillian performance and stuff like that. I also found, I don't know if you noticed, did it seem like Mozart was happiest there too? You know what I mean? Like, away from court, when he was just there, because people were appreciating it, and that's really all he ever wanted. He was his most content, I think, when he was at those, more I guess accessible, more sort of more public kind of performances, not the exclusivity of court, where tastes were almost politically motivated. Here, people were just enjoying stuff for the sake of enjoying it, and I think that seemed when the character was happiest.
And that's when, and that's an interesting thing to kind of tie it back to what I was talking about, the duality of the characters, right? You see that with him, but then you see it with his wife too, who's like, no, you're not taking like, unless he's giving us money, it's like, you're not doing this, like, you're above this, you're too good for this. You get his duality of like his love for his wife. He has this really strong love for her, but then he's also just like, I'm going to go out and like hang out with, like, it's never implied that he's sleeping with other women, except early on in the film before he marries her. But he's like always hanging out with other broads, and like, but then he has this moments with his kid where he's like, this really touching moment where he's watching him when he sleeps.
Mm-hmm.
But then he's also just like not present. And when the kids run away, he's just like, whatever. The kid goes with the mom, like leaves. He's like, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's the duality, I think, is such an important aspect of the whole film. And yeah, I think we could keep talking about this film for a long time. We didn't touch on kind of any of the film techniques and the musical aspects of the film, or the cinematography, the editing, the sound edit, like the score, the costumes. There's so much to talk about, but
the locations. I mean, they filmed a lot of this. You can tell, like, these are not sets. Like, these are like actual, Habsburg dynasty palaces. It seems like they're filming in. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and like a lot of those shots too, I think they're just they're iconic now, I think, with the film. But when he's conducting, the shots from below, shooting and seeing the audience behind him, and it's quite captivating. But I will conclude this conversation with the question that I ask every week, and this is a very interesting one. I'm curious, from your perspective, is there enough genius in this film to make this film, or this picture, a hell of a picture?
Yeah, I really like this movie. I enjoyed watching it, I must say. I'm glad it won Best Picture, because it does feel a little off-brand to me in some ways. I know we talked about this, and one of the things you touched on in your anti-Kansas City rag there was that there was a realism to the characters in a lot of ways, and that's sort of, to me, what felt off about it, in that, like, this was not... These people felt modern in a lot of ways, not necessarily because you could be a booze bag and a philanderer back then and be a complicated character, but the propriety of people was not there. You're used to seeing period pieces where, first of all, everybody's goddamn British, and no offense to the English, love the English, but it does seem like a crutch in North American productions, where it's like, let's make everyone British and people will think we're smart. You know what I mean? That's right. There's this Pavlovian compulsion that we have to just be like, oh, well, they're British, so this must be good, And
right.
They didn't do that here. They and people, even like the Emperor, played by the guy, he plays Mr. Rooney in Ferris Bueller, and I can't recall his name now, but like, he doesn't seem like a very typical, very typical emperor, you know what I mean? Sometimes his mannerisms and the way people behave, it has an odd sort of flair to it. And so that's what made it feel weird for a period piece. So I like that it's weird. I like that it's silly at times. And I like that it's serious. I'd love to see the theatrical release because this felt like it went a little long.
Yeah.
It's very close for me, but I'll say not a hell of a picture. A very good one, a very deserving Oscar winner, but not a hell of a pending seeing the theatrical release. Maybe you cut it down and it cracks it for me, but I don't know.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So for me, I'll echo everything you said. I thought it was, it's quite stunning, and I think it's worthy of a best picture at the Oscars. It's not a best picture you look back on and be like, the hell, what were they thinking? It makes sense, and it's deserving. I think the part I struggled with a bit was I'm not a huge classical music buff. I don't listen to it regularly, and I can appreciate it and I can't really understand it, but I hear the classic riffs and stuff, and I'm like, okay, I recognize that, I can see that, but like not having a strong appreciation for that maybe hinders it a bit for me, because I felt that a lot of the performance moments they dragged, right? You're like,
sure.
You're like, okay, I get it. Like, this one's about his dad. This one's the Figaro. This is, it's like, okay, I don't need to listen to literally 15 minutes of a song to get the idea of what the scene is trying to portray, right? Mm-hmm. So for that, it really sort of feels like it drags on, because for me, the interesting parts of the film, but the scenes with, him and his wife, or him and Salieri, or like, him writing, like, all these, like, all that, the stuff outside the music was the most interesting thing for me. So yeah, I'm with you. Not a hell of a picture for me, but yeah, no, great film, and I enjoyed it, and I'll definitely revisit it again. Interesting note I read on Wikipedia when kind of just doing a quick read through of this, up for the role of Mozart was Luke Skywalker himself, Mark Hamill.
Whoa.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it was down. I think it was down. It's what it seemed like between him and Tom Hulch. Yeah, Hulch. Tom Hulch. And he didn't want. They decided not to go with Mark Hamill because of Luke Skywalker, because he's so famous.
That's right. Played a similarly titanic figure, Luke Skywalker and Mozart. You ask around, I mean, it's probably like 50-50 who's more famous.
Yeah. You're not wrong.
No, not really.
But Tom Hulch is interesting because, like, we were saying before we jumped on, like, he doesn't even, I can't even recall anything else he's been in. He's been in Parenthood, and then it was in Animal House, and like, but he's not like, for getting a Best Actor nomination, he sort of, like, I want to say disappeared, like, not really, but he's pretty good.
The laugh is incredible. I love that. I can't decide if I love all of his performance there afterwards. I love the laugh. The laugh is probably worthy of an Oscar nom just on its own. But yeah, the totality of the performance, I'm not 100% sure on it. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. That's kind of, and yeah, maybe that's just sort of something that to revisit and reanalyze.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that concludes the 1980s and our Oscar run of the wonderful 1984, the year we were both born. And now we're driving into the 1990s next week with a doozy of a Best Picture winner. We went back and forth on this because the 90s is a bit contentious into the Best Picture winners. And there's some questionable ones. And did we do a questionable one? I don't know, David. What are we doing next week?
Well, you said we were going to drive in the 90s. I will correct you on that. We are going to sail into the 90s, or more accurately, steam power, coal-fueled engine our way into the 90s across the Atlantic Ocean.
Shakespeare in Love.
That's right.
No, sorry. Sorry.
No, with the the Titanic film, Titanic. The James Cameron, another period piece, another epic. Yeah, long film. This one they didn't hold back on to keep it under. You had mentioned that I think in the pre-recording that they for the theatrical release of Amadeus they cut it to 240 so it could fit on one VHS for home release. They did not worry about that for Titanic. I remember seeing the multi VHS box set,
Oh,
and
buddy.
man, yeah, I'm excited to talk about this because I haven't seen it in. I don't know if I ever saw it again after like the first time or two I saw it, which would have been around the release. I saw it in the theaters,
Yeah.
and then I would have definitely seen it like on home video there afterwards. And I don't know if I've seen it since. So we're talking, 20 years at least.
Oh, dude, Titanic. I went with my whole family and loved it when I first saw it. Like, loved it. I was like, this is the best, whatever. I remember renting it when it came out on VHS and sitting in my, it was like sitting in my, by myself watching it, weeping about like crying, like so emotional. I was like, this is amazing. And then I went through that period of like when because Titanic has a bit of a backlash now, and people have varying opinions on it, and you go through that where you watch it and you're sort of like, oh, this sucks, or like it's like you have these aggressive opinions on films that you might have liked in your past because like film criticism doesn't like it as much now anymore, but I've come back around on Titanic, and it's been a few years since I watched it, but last time I watched it, I was like, man, this is it's so good. And it's fun and crazy and wild and like shitty at parts, but then also really great. So
I mean, I think people were justifiably critical of it in its time too. I mean, I think there were a lot of naysayers because it was so damn popular that like, of course there has to be the inevitable contrarianism surrounding anything that big. And this was a phenomenon, an absolute. It cannot be overstated how big this movie was and for how long. It's madness.
Number one at box office for 20, almost like less than 20 years. Until like sort of like those Marvel movies came and dethroned it. But it was like, I mean, it's still up there.
Yeah.
Just like this, it's just, it's people were going like 10, 15, 20, 30 times to it in theaters.
Yeah. And the sustained success of it in theaters too. Like it was like number one, or it was, they kept it in theaters for what seemed like a year. We'll get the exact numbers on that for sure for the next episode. But it just seemed like it was interminably available to watch in theaters, and I'm very much looking forward to rewatching it and talking about it.
Yeah, me too. I love how this sort of like we can get it. We'll get into it, but the performances by Leo and Kate and like where their careers went, and like and I'm such a huge Leo fan, and it's like I can appreciate that he was like this was like peak stardom for him, and he just managed to narrowly stare his career into like this like best actor place where he could have gone in a totally another direction, where it was just like he could never get over, because similar to like the Mark Hamill thing that I just mentioned, right?
Yeah,
it's like we love Mark Hamill, but like Mark Hamill is Luke Skywalker, and it's like DiCaprio could have easily just been the guy from Titanic, and then that was it.
Navigated the iceberg-filled waters of stardom, you might say, and there
it is.
Yeah,
exactly.
The world's biggest metaphor strikes an iceberg. That's one of my favorite sort of lines on the Titanic, talking about the Titanic as a historical event. It's pretty great. So
so but more about Titanic next week, but this week so no hell of a picture this week, but Amadeus worth watching if you want to get your Mozart fill. So for David Hollinshurst, my name is Andrew Bartlett, and this has been another rip-roaring episode of Hell of a Picture.